Great. Good morning, everyone. So this is not going to be a very technical talk, but it is going to be a talk rich with data, some science, and also a lot of theory, some conjecture. The power of intuition in data science and why, at least I believe, it will always have a role. But let's debate that. A quick introduction to myself and Chandani that have been working on this piece. We've come to data science from actually quite a few different disciplines. Chandani was an engineer who spent many years in trading and then developed her toolkit in data science, and she's currently the founder of a startup called Aquan. Myself, my background's actually in economics and in the philosophy of economics. Before I spent many years in consulting in the field of advanced analytics, working across actually 8 sectors of the economy. And today I work with InMobi, a major AdTech player in India, and I lead the team in Bangalore, the data sciences and machine learning teams. Cool. So, what started us on this inquiry? It was actually a bit of a spark of inspiration from a friend of mine who said this to me. This friend, he is a professor of economics at NYU, and I met him 3 or 4 months ago. And I tried to ask him, so what is it about, how were you so successful? How, at just 30 years of age, you achieved tenure so young? And this is what he said to me. He said, well, the thing is, my research, I've realized, has been well received, not because of my abilities with mathematics. In fact, he's the kind of guy who, he didn't actually know what even a normal distribution was when he started his PhD program. But he says because of his ability to spot interesting questions and then investigate them further. And that's what got us thinking, what is this ability? What is this spotting interesting questions? So what we're going to take you through today is we're going to give you an interpretation of what intuition is. A lot of us have very different ideas. We're going to try to put 3 definitions on the table. In each of those definitions, we're going to argue what it means, why it's relevant to data science, how it applies to data science, and we're going to give you a few tips for how it affects your life as a data scientist, how it should change your behavior if you believe in this concept of intuition. And lastly, we also want to put out a theory of how we believe the understanding of intuition will inform future work in ML and AI. Some people might say that, look, forget intuition, let's just build better models and just be done with it. That's not the point. That's missing the point. We have to think of intuition as a tool in our toolkit to be better data scientists, something that's going to enhance our ability with data. And here's the big thesis we actually want to put out there. One is that as you try to understand the world, you try to understand different processes. You've got access to data and experiments, A/B testing, randomized controlled trials. What we believe is with intuition understanding, together with both these elements, is when you'll develop system views of what you're trying to understand, the full system of what's going on. And only when you understand the system, the causes, the consequences, are you able to think about alternative possibilities, what's called counterfactuals. Imagine different triggers, different interventions to understand how the system will behave. Alternative possibilities lead to something else. But the thing with AI, if you look at all the work, all the progress we've made in AI, the things that we do well today, we can anticipate and predict. We've got very sophisticated supervised learning, deep learning algorithms. We can recognize and associate. We can label, speech recognition, image recognition. We can optimize and evolve. We have good reinforcement learning systems emerging in this field of evolutionary algorithms. And increasingly, we're talking about being able to generalize, right, the work of DeepMind, artificial general intelligence. But something for us is missing, and that's how do you get machines to imagine, to think about new possibilities, to actually develop hypotheses themselves. And it's only, we believe, when you have all these 5 elements that you truly will have what we can call artificial intelligence. So our thesis is that, and what we want to argue today, is that it's the system view that ultimately enables you to do imagination, and we have to teach machines to be able to do just that. Now, looking at just how people historically have treated intuition, I really like this quote from Nikola Tesla. He said, "Instinct is something which transcends knowledge. We have undoubtedly certain finer fibers that enable us to perceive truth when logical deduction or any other willful effort of the brain is futile." And not just Tesla, there's enough quotes from other great thinkers, especially Einstein, who had this same instinct that there was something deeper in how the human mind worked that went beyond formalization of the mathematics. But then at the same time, there's been a more recent trend, and some of you will be rolling in your seats saying, no, but what about Daniel Kahneman, right? Thinking fast, thinking slow, 4 or 5 years ago, who told us expert intuition works less often than we think. In fact, someone's confidence in their intuition is not a good indicator of whether their hypothesis or their view of the world is valid. And increasingly, right, with the explosion of big data, with analytics, we see these kinds of views, which I picked up from an Intel executive who says, actually, the methods, practices of intuition are redundant now. We have data. Let's just use data to tell us what the answer is, the way the world works, the way the systems are working. So how do you reconcile, right, both of these very different viewpoints? Well, let's have a look at what we all thought. We sent out this survey a couple of days ago. Unfortunately, 100 of you in this room, I'm hoping, had a chance to get back. And the survey was, is there a sixth elephant in the room? Let's see what we thought. The first thing is, we asked, can you remember a time when you used a hunch or your feeling of the underlying problem to better understand what you were doing with your model? And I was happy to see that actually the vast majority of us agree that we've done this at least once or more, that we've been guided by our instinct, our hunch. But then, when we asked, so give us 3 words to describe what you think intuition means, we saw a smattering of very different responses. This is the word cloud. And actually, I said there were 100 of you that responded at least 3 times, and there was such a diversity of responses that even in the word cloud, there's just a handful of words that were frequent. But we still see words like data coming up, right? When you're thinking about intuition. We still see words like common sense. We see words like bias. So not everyone was aligned in really what intuition means to us and how to use it. And when we asked this provocative question, we said, when your results clash with your intuition, what do you do? The vast majority of us, 2/3 of us, say, I'll scrutinize my results, yes, but if the results hold, the results hold. Now, frankly, me personally, I would have been in the green bucket. I would have actually said, I would have a deep discomfort for a long time until I was able to reconcile what the data is telling me and what my intuition was telling me. But only a third of us say we're actually in that bucket. So we have different views. And if I was to ask you, hey, what are the characteristics of intuition? We might say things like, it's instantaneous. We might say things like, it's spontaneous. You can't explain where it comes from. We might say, it's beyond logic. It's not logical, it's not logical, and it's not non-logical. We might say, it's about having a holistic hunch, just an immediate holistic hunch. But the problem with all these views, right, it doesn't really explain what it is for us and what its impact can be. So we want to propose this 3-level hierarchy to understanding intuition. The first point is intuition as having judgment. Second, intuition is being able to see the causes and consequences in what you're trying to understand. And lastly, the kicker, intuition is seeing the system view as a whole, appreciating the full system. Now, one caveat just before I get started. There's also another view of intuition that my colleague Varun alerted me to. And I saw it a lot in the talks over the last few days. There's a notion of intuition when you're trying to understand how an algorithm works, the mathematical intuition of what's happening. That's not what we're talking about, to be clear. We're talking about intuition when you're trying to understand what's happening in the world. And your algorithm is just a tool to understand what's happening in the world. So we're talking about stuff that happens out there, whether a business problem, a social problem, whatever it may be. Let's take one of these and explore them further. So I really like this quote by Benno Mandelbrot, a famous polymath and mathematician, who said, intuition is not something that's been God-given to me. It's not the whisperings of a goddess, to borrow a phrase from my friend Farhad. It's something I've trained. It's something that I've trained to be able to understand obvious shapes which were initially rejected as absurd. What does this training mean? About a year ago, I was having a conversation with Prithvi, he's the chief risk officer at a growing Indian startup called InCred. He's someone who actually spent a long time training me a few years ago in advanced analytics. And Prithvi is someone who spent years in the world of credit assessing. 5 or 6 years at Capital One and also 5 or 6 years at McKinsey with the financial practice. And Prithvi said to me that as he's building algorithms to do credit assessing, to decide whether someone should receive a loan or not, what he finds is that no matter what he does, he still can't quite get the same performance that people in the cities and towns of India that play this role of credit assessors are able to do. People that go face-to-face with someone and do the credit assessment and use their internal instinct to decide whether someone deserves credit or not. And he found this a genuine challenge to build models that could truly replicate that. He said that from years of experience, what they developed in their mind was just not something he can easily replicate. This thread of thinking of intuition like this actually goes a long way back, as far back as the 1940s, where Herbert Simon, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, started looking at intuition and said it's a way of codifying simple analyses that get frozen into habit in the person. So let's try to sketch a definition. If I was to try to describe it, these are the words I would use. I'd say in this case, it's deciding between different alternatives, evaluation of decisions based on alternatives. It's something that with talent and experience, even a beginner can become an expert who sees without needing to rely on rules or historical cases. And it's also something that we can't always articulate. It's a feeling in the gut, and it's a literal feeling in the gut, which I'll explain in just a second. I think of it as it's when people have become a trained black box algorithm themselves in doing some kind of decision-making, typically from years of experience. And then there's good work by Gary Klein in this book that was written in the late 90s, Sources of Truth. Building on this, people have done research in different professions. We've seen that there's evidence that hedge fund managers rely on this notion of intuition, nurses, midwives, even the Marine Corps, the US Marine Corps, hires for people that have intuition. And then a good, strong research company like Bell Atlantic similarly looks explicitly for people who they believe have good intuition. So it's not something that we're making up. What would the science of this be? Well, for me, the most influential work I've come across is actually this work by John Coates. And I love John Coates because he's very multidisciplinary. He's a guy who spent years at a Wall Street trading desk, has a PhD in economics and finance, but then went and did a PhD in psychology before he wrote this book. And what he explained was that what's actually happening here is that in addition to our conscious brain, our conscious processing, we all have a pre-attention processing system. Now, this system is not driven by the brain because the brain only has limited capacity. The conscious brain only has limited capacity for what it can process, despite all the rich sensory information we receive daily. He said what's happening is there's actually a brain of the gut. There's a brain that's driven by the endocrine system, by the flush of hormones that we receive. And learning is actually also encoded from those flush of hormones and from those experiences that we have. It's not just conscious learning. He explained this intuitive knowledge that we feel, that we get, actually has genuine physiological phenomena, somatic charges, meaning somatic is something experienced by the body. I said that literal feeling of the gut. Or affective charges, emotions. But those are actual genuine guides, compasses that are telling us what to do, how to behave, based on genuine historical work, historical experience that we might have had. How does this apply as a data scientist? Our 3 tips. One is when you're trying to solve a new problem or process, get into it, experience it yourself. If you're doing credit assessment, go see what it's like when someone is being a credit assessor. Study and learn from the people who are the trained human algorithms. What are they thinking about? It's a way for you to generate ideas on features or new data that you can collect, if you can push them to understand what they're thinking about. And then when someone comes to you and says, no, it's my intuition why I'm deciding this, right? Maybe it's a very adamant product manager, maybe it's someone from business. I only trust them when I'm convinced that they've actually genuinely had time to develop such intuition, meaning that I know that they've seen and experienced a lot of data that's relevant to the problem in their career. And to share with you one example, an example from Arpan from our team, who started working on creatives to about last quarter, it was, a few months ago. And creatives are those advertising images that we all see when advertising is put to us. And what Arpan did, the first thing he did, right, before reading any papers, he spent time with the creative artists to make creatives. He spent a good solid 2 weeks just sitting next to them, shadowing them, understanding what they were doing, interviewing them. He must have interviewed about 10 of them and built an idea of what actually is going on when they're making creatives. How do they see and understand creatives? And he put out a report that he took our whole team through for a couple of hours explaining what was going on before he even started on building algorithms to address the problem. There's an image of Jurassic Park because we spend a lot of time actually looking at Jurassic Park creatives for some reason. It was that time of year when the movie was coming out. So that's how I remember this example best. It can break down. This is not foolproof, because you do need a high level of expertise, there's no doubt. Kahneman says, look for disciplined intuition. When someone has had immediacy of feedback, the quality of feedback has been good, and we know there's been regularity in the process that supported their human intuition. And there are issues like cognitive biases that do happen among people, and if you've read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, you'll be familiar with all of this. And some people will also say a lot of the data and research I shared suffers from selection bias, potentially. It's very hard to really prove one way or the other. But I would stay a healthy skeptic for that reason. Let's look at a more challenging interpretation, seeing causes and consequences. And this quote by the computer scientist Judea Pearl strikes me. And he says, now he only looks at causal relationships as fundamental building blocks. He doesn't look at probabilistic relationships. He thinks of them as surface phenomena. But really what matters to us is that causal machinery that underlies and propels our understanding of the world. What would this look like? It's seeing causal connections based on your understanding of the concepts at work. If intuitive judgment is the black box, we can think of this as actually the open box that's happening in our minds, where there is a causal understanding that's driving our decisions. It enables us to do things like a rapid consistency check. Is everything that we're seeing, hearing, actually connected in a consistent way as we would expect? And often if you push someone, you can find this theoretical causal flow they're thinking about. So to share with you an example from the world of trading and from my co-author, Chandani, she's got one example. She can't be here, so she recorded this a couple of nights ago.
A really good example of this is the very famous 1906 short of Union Pacific by Jesse Livermore. Jesse Livermore is this legendary short trader. He was on a vacation in Atlantic City in 1906, and he just casually happened to visit a brokerage house, saw the stock Union Pacific on the ticker tape, and just shorted it on a hunch. Union Pacific was one of the most bullish stocks at the time. It was such a random trade that even the broker was surprised. Are you sure? Do you want to sell? Did you mean buy? But he just felt like it was the right thing to do. So he sold the stock, and surprisingly enough, the next day the great earthquake of San Francisco hit, causing a lot of destruction and millions of losses to Union Pacific and property. Actually, he cut his vacation short and came back to New York, and the stock still held strong. But after a few days, when the news of how much destruction happened in New York City, the stock finally started falling. He held on to his position, and he finally exited almost close to the low, making $300,000 in a week. It's a lot of money now, but back then it was sure a lot of money. He obviously could not have known that the earthquake is going to hit the city, but when he reanalyzed his trade later, he felt like what had sort of formed his intuition was this feeling at the back of his mind saying, in a bull market, what happens to an overbought stock when there's unexpected bad news overnight and there are no buyers?
Some of you might say that intuition of an earthquake, is that what we're talking about? And the answer is no. The point is not that he saw the earthquake coming. That's not the point. The point is he understood the system implicitly, the causal process that would have happened if a bad shock happened. And he said that there is a bull market, and there's such a big bull market that if a bad shock happens, I know things are going to switch all of a sudden. And it's that causal understanding that drove the decision, not that he saw the earthquake coming. That's missing the point. An example from our own work at InMobi, in actually just the last month, Kunal from our team, who works in e-commerce and predicting whether people will transact, a proposal was put out there for a new model that was intended to learn from people's historical behavior, certain events in people's historical behavior, in order to predict whether they would do a certain transaction. And in the proposal, point of view was made that we can actually junk a lot of that historical data. It's just not worth logging, it's not worth the storage cost, because it will not affect subsequent transactions. I can't go into all the details, but just to paint the picture of what was happening there. And Kunal had a very strong knee-jerk reaction to it. And he genuinely believed some of those signals in that historical data in those events were going to affect subsequent transactions. And he could have just let it be and said, I'll just accept the proposal and just get on and build my model. But he was fundamentally uncomfortable with it. He took 2 weeks out working with one of our interns, Rachna, and developed a data set to test his hypothesis. It wasn't easy work. It generally took 2 weeks of effort, and proved that actually his intuition on this, on that causal process, was valid. Specifically, without telling you what the signals were, 40% of the transactions that we saw for particular e-commerce players were driven by the signals that Kunal insisted had to be in the data set. He was driven by intuition in making that call. How do you apply this? You need to look at your data with great curiosity, to be honest. And you have to get your hands dirty in looking at the data. How is the data connected? Don't sit 2 or 3 stages removed from your data and just focus on the algorithms. When you have an intuition, commit to it and test it, the way Kunal did. Actively tested it. I have this test I do quite often. I've been doing it with some interns recently. I call it the beer test. And I say, when I have an intuition, I'm going to tell you my intuition, and I'm going to bet you a beer on it. And if you prove to me that it's not right, I will buy you that beer. And there's lots of beers here because I get it wrong a lot of the time, I have to confess. But I allow myself to test my intuitions, which only strengthens them over time. If you find a surprise, something that you weren't expecting, you have to expect in order to have a surprise. But that's a signal for you to go deeper and probe what's going on. And we don't do this enough as data scientists. We need to keep asking, what are the causes? What are the causes? What are the causes for the results I'm seeing? If you're asking that with every result you're seeing, you will start to build a much better intuition of every problem that you're working on. There are objections. The famous correlation versus causality. We've all heard it 100 times. I will let it be, and Kahneman can have his day on that. Or you could say, hey, why do I need this? I'll just feature engineer, and that's what deep learning's for. Give it the data, and I'll just feature engineer. It's not always that simple. We saw in that example with Kunal that we had to decide whether we were going to collect the data. We had to make that decision before we could even do any feature engineering. And to make that decision, that has to be guided by intuition. Is it worth collecting the data? Is it worth storing the data? Is it worth logging the data? Those kinds of decisions often have to be guided by intuition. There's also a risk of people forming global impressions very quickly, which Kahneman talks about. And he says, the way to deal with this is sometimes delay your intuition. Don't jump to conclusions, but delay your understanding until you make a claim, until you put a hypothesis out there. The last piece of this puzzle actually aligns with my previous work in development economics. And this is a chart, very complex chart, I know, which I made about 8, 9 years ago. And I was trying to summarize the world of the methodologies applied in development economics. And I know you can't read the chart, but I believe there were 3 paradigms, the 3 edges of the triangle. On one is randomized control trials. In our world, we might call that A/B testing. On the bottom right is econometric modeling. In our world, that is actually data science. It's taking historical data that exists and finding statistical regularities in that data. But the third piece of every puzzle for me, every way of learning in the world, is what's in the bottom left here, which is theory, which is a view of the theory of how the system holds together, not informed by data, not informed by testing. And that leads me to this point on intuition as the system view. What does this mean? Quote by Ronald Coase. We all probably know Ronald Coase well from a quote that's often quoted in data science, which is about data science is torturing the data until it confesses. That's also a quote from Ronald Coase. But this one, he says that, faced between results and a theory, I would much always prefer having a theory, because a theory explains to me what's going on, how it works. And we asked us, right? We all answered, or 100 of us answered this question. Do we think theories and hypotheses are as important as data? I was very happy to see that the vast majority of us, nearly 80, 90% of us, do think so. So what does that mean for us? Well, one great example, I love this example, is we have discovered the secret of life. Watson and Crick, 1953. They walk into a pub in Cambridge. The pub was Eagle Pub. If you ever visit Cambridge, you have to visit that pub. And they announce this loudly. We've discovered the secret of life. What have they discovered? DNA. They discovered DNA. And you might say, hey, that was great empirical work. They discovered DNA through empirical methods. Not entirely true. 10 years earlier, in 1943, they were sitting in a set of lectures by Ernest Schrödinger, in Dublin. And what Ernest Schrödinger did was actually explain the concept of DNA from theory. He said, the laws of thermodynamics mean that we have to have some kind of consistent molecule that's stable in spite of the laws of thermodynamics. And he described that molecule as an aperiodic crystal. And it's this concept, and he fleshed out what he meant by an aperiodic crystal, but this concept that stuck in the minds of Watson and Crick. So they knew what they were looking for. So much so that in 1953, after they discovered DNA, they sent their paper to Ernest Schrödinger, and they said, we were inspired by you. So even at this example, they were led with a concept that came from theory. Let's sketch a definition. How would I think about this? Having a mental model, having representations of the world, of the system, of the processes that you're trying to solve. Ideally, it's self-enclosed and it's an exhaustive model of what you're trying to explain. I almost think of it as an internal simulator you've built in your mind for what's going on. And the more you experience a particular system, a set of processes, the stronger that internal simulator will become. What's the science of this? Vastly underdeveloped, hugely underdeveloped. Because if I was to ask this question of how does intuition drive imagination, which just drives learning, we know very little about that. And I love this quote from Gary Marcus, a psychologist at NYU, who says, in all the ways that we've taught computers to learn, we still can't replicate this behavior by his 3 or 4-year-old child, who, when given a chair, will find 100 different ways to use that chair, which we've not taught her. We'll find 100 different uses just from understanding the concept of a chair. And the crux of this is that even our strongest learning algorithms today, deep learning or reinforcement learning, still do not even approximate the way a child learns. Don't get anywhere close. So what would a science of this field seek to achieve? And I really like this definition by Sridhar Madhavan, a paper he published this year. He says we need to develop an imagination science, a way of generating data, samples that are novel, different from the distribution that we might have in our training data. And this is what will address the issue of understanding the causal processes, enabling us to do causal reasoning. Back to this view that we suggested at the beginning, and hopefully it's starting to make sense. What we're saying is that if you want to develop that system view there, you can't just do it directly from the data or your experiments. It needs better understanding of the system, which is driven by your intuition. And with that understanding of the system, you're able to do counterfactuals. Imagine an alternative possibilities. Being able to imagine an alternative possibilities is actually a very rational process, a very systematic process that will give rise to imagination and a way of us coding how imagination can happen. And as we said, imagination is a big piece for us in what's missing in artificial intelligence. One step that I haven't had time to go through in detail is why alternative possibilities, counterfactuals, actually drive imagination and how that's actually a very rational process. If you're interested, there's an excellent piece of work by Ruth Byrne on the rational imagination. It was written many years ago now, but she made this argument very strongly. And I refer you to the book if you need to be proven otherwise. This view also aligns with what Judea Pearl, the Israeli computer scientist, is starting to describe as a causal hierarchy. That there's association, probability of y given x, finding correlation. That's intuition as judgment for us. There's intervention, probability of y given x happened, or z happened, that we definitely saw x happening. That's seeing the causes and consequences for us. And there's probability of y given an x prime or z prime that we haven't seen happen. We have no direct evidence that those things have happened. That for us is what imagination gives us, the ability to think through these counterfactuals. And that comes from what we said is a system view. And Judea Pearl has even gone as far as trying to articulate what a learning architecture would look like. I don't have time to go into details of this. I could refer you to the paper, which was just written a few months ago. But you'll see here that in this learning architecture, what's important is he has a role for assumptions. And assumptions is a simpler word for the concept of theory. And in his architecture, he explains that the theory has to be captured in graphical models. That's how we'll be able to codify this theory. But what I really want you to pay attention to is that he's saying that with an understanding of the theory and the data, we can actually develop this concept of fit indices, which is actually saying how well is our theory reflected in the data? How well is theory and data combining to tell the same story? And he talks about how to develop such methods. But I really believe that an imagination architecture will have a system like this. We still have to do the imagining, but you'll be able to test that the imagining is making sense in a learning system like this. And when we asked everyone, we said, hey, do you think intuition or the role that it plays in your lives as data scientists, as data engineers, is it going to get replaced? Will a machine ever be able to do it? I think we were very divided. Look, very nice normal distribution, which tells me none of us has any clue whatsoever. But there are people who strongly agree. But there's a chunk of us who are saying, like, we partly agree, maybe, but there's still something I believe that me as a human, only me as a human can do. And so, my advice to you is, keep your job as a data scientist for as long as possible by using intuition. Keep your job. And our 3 tips, Rajiv, our senior mentor at InMobi, pushes us on our Thursday calls with this phrase: examine the system artifacts long before you start building your model. What does he mean? Get into the data, look at the data, try to think what's going on from your data long before you slap an algorithm on it that gives you results immediately. Every time we jump into the problem, and all our team knows this, and we start getting into the algorithm, he stops us and he says, why haven't you examined the system artifacts? Why haven't you explored the data and showed me what the data is telling you long before you've applied a model? Consciously determine what your own mental model is, how you think about it. And have proactive theories. I love it when someone comes forward and say, look, this is what I believe is going on. And they put across a very proactive theory. And lastly, be open to your intuitions. You have to be open to this possibility and not believe that you're all mechanical robots. You have to realize that there's something else happening in our brains which can guide, which you can learn from. So allow that to flow, allow that to come out. Capture ideas, articulate your ideas, be open to this. Finally, no presentation is done, right, without a thought from Steve Jobs, of course, right? So it's not finished until you've got a thought from Steve Jobs, because that's when everyone believes it. But I like this particular quote from him, where he said, from all his time in India, his biggest takeaway was how in India, actually, we haven't developed with that same system of excruciating rational thought that was developed in the West. He believed that in India there was almost a special power of people using their intuitions, in particular in the Indian countryside. And he said that's what's needed to drive progress, this understanding of intuitions, which is, as I said, he thought was strongest in India. Something that really winds me up recently is that there's all this talk about China's AI strategy, right? There's not a day or a week that goes by where someone is not writing about China's big, mega AI strategy. I picked up this report that was written in March at Oxford, deciphering China's AI dream. It's so complex, it's so well developed that people have to, in the West, decipher China's AI dream. And it winds me up because I'm like, where's India's AI strategy? Why don't we have lots of documents and a clear strategy? And I just wonder that maybe our India strategy, our counter to China, can be, okay, we're going to build AI, but we're just going to use our intuition to do it. That's how we're going to get there. So, all I say is, I do think it's a superpower we have, and hopefully it's something we strongly have in India. So keep calm and keep intuiting. Thanks. Oh. Okay, apparently I finished earlier than I was expecting, so we have a few minutes for questions. I was kind of avoiding the questions because I know they're going to be controversial questions.
Hi, Avi. Thanks for the talk. My name is Nikesh. I was wondering, are there processes around collecting intuitions? Right? So maybe I have an intuition.
Yeah.
Right? But other people have intuitions too.
Yeah.
Right? And have you seen kind of structured ways of thinking through that and kind of any examples of that?
Yeah. I think it's a fair question. So just to repeat, if people didn't hear that, Nikesh's question was, hey, do we have any structured processes for actually collecting intuitions? To be honest, all we've suggested is tips, right? Heuristics or things that you can apply to do it. And it's just because this area as a science is not so well developed, and we don't really understand what's going on in the brain to get to this, that it's hard to say there's a structured process. So in all honesty, the best I can offer is applying these tips of being open to it, trying to push out proactive theories, pushing yourself, always asking what are the causes, what's going on, building a view is the best I can offer. And it's best, great scientists who push boundaries, Nobel Prize winning scientists, are actively the people who are doing this, who do this best. Take inspiration from them most. Any other questions? Oh, there's another question.
Hi. Yeah.
So, hello.
Hi.
Yeah. My question is related to the scenario when you talked about credit score from your friend Prithvi.
Yeah.
So, when you say that they are not able to achieve the same level of performance as done by the humans in that system,
yeah,
what do you think is the main element missing? Is it human bias? As Daniel Kahneman also mentioned that it's the only thing missing. And if it is missing, how can we incorporate that limited amount of required bias into our model or data science solutions? And is this bias also refers to the fifth element which you are talking about?
Yeah. So interesting question. So just to recap if people didn't hear that, his question was, what's going on when a credit assessor, a human credit assessor is making decisions? Is there a way of incorporating that in the algorithms? Or is it just bias that really actually should be ignored? So the first thing is, it's not bias because the results actually play out. When you actually look at these decisions made, they tend to be high quality decisions and you can directly compare them to the decisions that algorithms are making. And often enough, people are making more higher quality decisions. What I think is going on, and it's my view, that people are picking up on a lot of non-verbal cues in someone's behavior, similarly to how a lot of us have an instinct on whether someone's telling the truth or not, even if we can't say why we know that. And there are all these non-verbal cues that we as people give away when we're interacting with another person, which implicitly is what a credit assessor is picking up. When a story is being highlighted, when data is being provided from someone being assessed, they're picking up on these additional non-verbal cues. Can an algorithm do that? Absolutely. We just have to be able to collect that data to the same extent that a human can collect it with sensory information. So intuition is having judgment. There's no doubt that algorithms will get there, but our intuition will help us decide, right, what are the features and how we have to learn for algorithms to be able to mimic that same level of performance. Cool. I think there was another question here.
Yeah. Interesting point you mentioned about that one, about the assessors picking up different cues from what they're seeing the person in front of them. So there are a lot of instincts that are at play and which have gotten developed over millions of years of evolution, like survival instincts and fear and whatnot things come into picture. Indians are going to beat it by intuition. That's actually Indians are going to beat it by their habit of judging others. I don't know. That is one part. And second part was about there is a divide about how people see intuition. So some people are supporting it, some people are against it. This is again going towards the personality types itself. So there is a factor about how a person reacts in their typical life. So if I am to refer to the MBTI types, there is a division on the intuitive types and the sensing types. A sensing type of person would be more inclined to take data as it is and take that as the truth, whereas an intuitive person would rely more on intuition. So I think when we take intuition, instead of taking it as a box of inputs or it being same for every person, we should try to also look at what variation in intuition itself is, right? So if we could model intuition itself instead of modeling a system per se, then that can act as an input to several other problems that we are trying to solve.
Yeah, so I think you had four interesting questions there. Let me try to recall them and get them in order, at least. So one is that the MBTI distinction is not the same for me. Because the intuition we're talking about is actually built from sensing. Like MBTI sets up this dichotomy between people who just think intuitively, which is what they mean as thinking at a high level or seeing the concepts that are at play, versus people who think with granular data, what they call sensing. I don't think that's a dichotomy. I think you can have someone who absorbs and learns from granular data and still does the intuiting and understands the concepts, which is the same type of intuition that we're talking about here, learning from sensory data. The second point you made on, remind me of the first point actually, you said a lot of stuff.
It was actually more of a comment where we are saying that the survival and fear kind of behaviors that drive judgment.
Yes. So I think, so you're absolutely right. I pointed this out. There are all sorts of cognitive biases that people have, and that will affect different interpretations of intuition, as we've laid out here. There's no doubt about that. Which is why I think you also have to be skeptical when you're learning from someone. And if you think that someone has not seen enough data, or there's too much risk of one of Kahneman's 20 cognitive biases at work, you're still aware of them, sensing them. If that's the case, then use your better judgment and don't learn from those cases. So I do think we have to be aware of them, but I can't think of anything else other than saying you have to understand them, look out for them, and filter for them if it's happening. And just remind me of your third point. Or hopefully I've answered enough.
So the third point was about intuition itself is not just one entity. Like it's not the same for 10 experts in the same domain. It's there is a variance within that as well. So how about just trying to model what intuition itself is, and then it could be a problem about credit assessments, or it could be some other problem. Let's take that variance or that thing as an input to that model instead of looking that as a model in isolation.
So I mean, I totally agree. And that was the third interpretation we had of intuition as a system view, because the experts on a given system are going to be different. Different systems will have different experts who better understand them. If we can codify how their understanding of the system and get an algorithm to tease that out, or even put it in directly, as in Pearl's case, as assumptions, I think that's the answer. So we still have to learn from those domain experts, and every case, every system we build, will build from different intuition. There's no doubt about that for me. If there's anything else, we'll take it offline. You had a lot of interesting ideas.
Hi, Amit. Thanks for the talk. So most of us here are in a corporate world, and intuition presumably needs a lot of thought. Even though it's a gut feeling, it needs a lot of thought. So how, in a corporate world, we run after deadlines, one after the other, right?
Yeah.
How do you handle employees? I need time to think about it, right? And we could think never-endingly, right?
Yeah, a fair point. I think there are lots of challenges with trying to do this in the corporate world. Just as an aside, one challenge which I didn't bring out today is what's called the hippo problem, the highest person in the room's view. And so often when it comes down to highest paid person in the room's view, so often when it comes down to these decisions where the data only shows you part of the system, and then someone has to make a call on what's really happening, it will be the highest paid person's view in the room. So there are risks like that. And to your point, like, how do you cultivate the environment that people are able to do this? I think that's what data science teams have to take ownership of. And the reason it's a data science team and has a bent towards research and thinking, as opposed to a data analyst team or a pure play engineering team, is to be able to create that space for people to come up with novel ideas of what's happening that they can then test via models. We as in our team at InMobi, we constantly have that balance to strike. And we're constantly like trying to remind ourselves, okay, we try to do a lot of the here and now work, and that's important for us. We also want to keep time aside for more speculative stuff, for new ideas, where we'll just talk. We won't talk to the product managers or the engineers or the business people. We'll just talk among ourselves and create speculative ideas that might lead to the next use case. We try to get that balance, but it's tough. Was there a question? No? Is that it? Oh, one last question. Over here. We'll have to do the run.
Hi.
Hi.
Talk. My question is, so intuition is like vary from person to person. So my intuition might not be valid in the situation that I'm dealing. So what's the trade-off that you see in terms of effort and time I should put so that my intuition also get tested, and also I don't miss on the new things that data might tell me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of this was we try to get across in our tips. So one is, if you're coming new to a problem, accept you don't have intuition. You're not going to be the person that's going to see through the data and find relationships immediately. That's why when you're coming new to a problem, you have to over-invest, right, as Arpan was doing in that example, to building the intuition yourself and getting more experience of what's happening, looking into the data from different angles, looking at the people that are making decisions who have better judgment in a particular case. You have to over-invest in it up front. And there'll come a time, and I don't know if it's It's probably not in 1 month, maybe it's 2 or 3 months. In some cases, it's only when someone's looked at data for 3 or 4 years they truly have this intuition. Frankly, it's problem dependent, but there'll come a time when you start to see things that you haven't seen directly in the data. You'll have like strong gut instinct on certain relationships. You'll see a significant coefficient, and you'll understand why that coefficient is significant when you've done a regression analysis. It won't just be a single data point that you're reading, but there'll be some deeper understanding which you'll be able to articulate. That point comes, you have to, when you don't have it, you're entering into your problem, you have to overinvest in developing it. Cool. I think we pause there. Good. Right. Thanks, everyone.